Welcome everyone to this specially recorded recap of the session Leading in Complex Times presented by Joy Goldman and Petra Platzer. This was delivered on March 23rd, and here you have a Cliff Note summary version for your reflection. As you know, this session is an experiential learning module, and it's part of a leadership development series that we launched in January. The focus for today is to introduce you to a new thinking paradigm, and this is really both and. And the intention of this learning series is to create experiential learning. So if you are able to come to these live, that will benefit you the most. The objectives from this session are to be able to differentiate between problems to solve and interdependent tensions to leverage, which are in fact known as polarities. And at the end of this recording, you will have gone through 4 of the 5 steps of how to leverage a polarity called SMALL. In addition, we will do a review of your executive team's current state results, where you completed 3 particular polarity map survey assessments. And through this recording, as well as this entire series, you are going to be navigating the learning you in the process. And the reason that we're going through all these objectives is to really increase your leadership capacity. As the world you navigate, whether at home and at work, continues to get more complex, filled with more unknowns and constant change. So, as is shown here by a well-known man, Gandhi, we are going to go through the learning you. And really, when we are learning, we're raising both our consciousness and our competence. And if you think about this process, whenever we begin, we don't know what we don't know. This is that ignorance is bliss state. Once we start to understand there is something we don't know, we become conscious, but we are not yet competent. So at this point is usually when we enter the learning curve and we start to recognize we're learning something. Then the journey as we are gaining skills and experience and practice is really from phase 2 to phase 3. We are gaining conscious competence where we know what we know. And then after lots of practice, lots of experience and competence, you will become unconsciously competent, where you don't have to actually think about what you are doing. Now, as adult learners, we often get into a learning modality and recognize, okay, I've now just understood something I don't know, and we try to short circuit the learning you, this phase between quadrants 2 and 3, and this is where we can result in frustration and burnout because we instantly think we should be masters. So the invitation for you here and through all of your learning processes is to see this smiley face and give yourself the space and the grace to take time between quadrants 2 and 3, that it's not instant mastery. So there will be some introduction about polarity thinking as well as your assessments and discussing the next steps. Now, even though this is a recording, you have an invitation to look at this particular simulation where there is a rescue team, there's fallen rock, and the objective is to work together to get these folks out safely. And you can see a list of strengths on the right. And the question is, what 2 strengths would you use to plan the rescue? So as you're listening to this, just write down 2 responses on a piece of paper. Once you have done that, you can then move on to the next thinking. Whereas when we were in session, this was a small group exercise, but notice this is still important for you to do because it's going to introduce you to what the thinking paradigm is we're going to introduce next. So you have this next scenario for the folks who have fallen into the cave and there's a flash flood warning and the water levels are rising. So now in this situation, as you think about it, which 2 strengths would your team have to use in a rescue attempt? And you can even do this at home with your family. Just say, hey, and again, you have the same list of strengths. The reason for going through this is just to start to discern and figure out, did the solution seem clear-cut Were some things easy, this is this and this is this? Or were some other things not so clear cut, where you had to think about, depends on if it's about people or process. This is the distinction that we want to enlighten you about.
Looking at this, some of you, your attention might have gone to the white. And for others of you, your attention may have gone to the black design, and you come up with an image in your mind that might have equaled one of the items on the right that are listed on the right. The idea behind this, which introduces polarity thinking, is there's not one right answer here. There's a both and. There is the foreground and the background. So if whether you said faces or a vase, both are correct. So this begins an introduction to this additional way of thinking. So in addition to traditional problem solving, either or thinking, there's both and thinking, which are interdependent pairs. And the thought leader behind this was Barry Johnson, and is Barry Johnson, who introduced this in 1975 and is still going strong. And I believe he's somewhere around 80 or so years old and still making a difference. The graphic you see below illustrates both thinking types, each alone insufficient. So what Barry Johnson illustrated, as you can see from the text and as we discussed, is that these interdependent pairs are inherently unsolvable problems. They don't go away. And he describes, as we will describe, the energy dynamic illustrated by the infinity loop that represents this predictable pattern with these polarities. And there's a process and a map and a methodology by which you can illustrate and assess these. So it's an interdependent pair. What's important about the poles that represent these pairs is that they are positively or neutrally named. So as an example, inhale and exhale is one example, activity and rest, both of those desirable. Always these pairs work in service to a greater purpose. So in both of these, maintaining a healthy lifestyle would be the greater purpose. And there's also there's the dynamic energy, and then there's also a fear. So how does this energy dynamic work? So if we were to look at this, the inhale part of this dynamic, in and of itself, this makes sense. It looks like, yes, we need to inhale in order to thrive. We don't want to die, which is not having enough oxygen. If we were to look at this just alone, we would say, yes, that's correct. However, it's insufficient. So if we were to look at the right side, we exhale also to thrive, avoid dying, releasing carbon dioxide because there's too much. So instead of answering A or B, which as you may have guessed is a trick question, both are correct. Both are technically accurate in and of themselves, but neither complete. So I will continue to show additional illustrations to get this idea of what's the difference between a problem to solve with one right answer and these interdependent pairs. And then also what's that energy dynamic. So the upside of focusing on activity is we want to build muscle strength and capacity. That's a good thing. All of us know, some of us weekend warriors, some of us on the go all the time, that if we focus on activity to the neglect of rest, we will eventually become exhausted. One might say during COVID, this was a real risk. We were going all the time. So what do we want to do if we notice energy depletion and exhaustion? We want to restore energy and replenish through rest. Great, unless we rest too long without energy expenditure, without activity, and we get muscle atrophy and weakness. So where do we want to go? Back to the upside of activity. So what you notice in this is that we need both of these poles in order to have a thriving, healthy lifestyle. We often talk about going from and to something. And again, that is the predictable sequence that in life, what we may focus on is what we don't want, which is the unintended consequence, and what we move towards, which is what we want. And again, it's an infinity loop. This next slide talks about, so how in human systems do we end up getting stuck in focusing exclusively on problems? And part of that dynamic is because of the long feedback loop. And all of you, when I work with organizations, and we work with organizations, we sometimes hear concerns from tenured staff that if we wait things out, something will reappear again, right? Whether it's a flavor of the month or what have you. And the reason for that is that there's a delay in perhaps focusing on margin to the exclusion of focusing on mission, right? And so because of that delay, we can have a misdiagnosis which causes us to waste time, energy, and resources. We want to make sure that you recognize that either or problem solving is necessary and when to use it. So there are best practices for treating COVID patients, right? That is an either or. Do we use this personal protective equipment? Do we use an N95 or do we use a cloth mask? Well, there's evidence behind those. What is our best source for licensed staff and recruitment? What minimal staffing levels? Either or problem solving has a role. And separately, it is not sufficient in dealing with our complex challenges. So what hallmarks polarities as distinct from problems to solve is they are ongoing. When we look at the dollars available for healthcare and quality, that tension will exist always. So they're not solvable, these tensions, these thorny issues. And they must be leveraged together over time. They cannot stand alone. And you see here listed some examples. During the session, we broke you out into an activity, which Petra will describe shortly. What we wanted to highlight to illustrate the differences and the polarities that may exist within your team are differences in your DISC profiles, and also differences, if you remember standing outside that beautiful October day last year in the teamwork cycle, there were differences as far as where you gravitated in your favorite part of work. And all of these are needed, right? We can't do one without the other. We can't initiate without completion. So this begins to illustrate the inherent polarities within your team.
All right, so based on the two examples that Joy just showed about your executive team styles and activity for you to still be able to leverage independently, and you can still have this discussion with your teammates or others from point of how to map a polarity. The invitation here, while you are doing this recording or directly afterwards, is to actually map the polarity of decisive and reflective. These are the two poles that, when leveraged together, the greater purpose is to be able to make effective decisions in a timely way. And when these are not leveraged well together, your unintended and unwanted outcome is ineffective decisions. So the way to go about mapping a polarity when you have two poles, let's say that you start with pole 1, we'll name it decisive. So begin by listing 2 or 3 benefits. What are the positive results when being decisive? And so you just list that, make a 2x2 table. This is the upper left quadrant. This is the upsides. Once you've thought of those, next think about what are some of the downside consequences or negative results when you are only focused on being decisive without taking the time to be reflective. So again, list 2 or 3 of just the downsides of only focusing on this pole of decisiveness to the neglect of not being reflective or thoughtful. Once you've identified those, now you naturally can think of the upsides. What's the solution to these negative results, which you will see will also be the upsides of the other pole. So when you are being reflective, what are some of the 2 or 3 benefits? And then once you have those identified, the same flow that you've just been learning is to think about, if you are just being reflective and thoughtful, to the neglect of being decisive and action-oriented, what are some of the downsides? And when you've gone through that kind of mapping, you now have a polarity map. And as you think about what you've identified in this table for yourself, and hopefully in discussion with your team members, you can start to discuss what are some of the benefits, how do we leverage and get the results of both of the upsides. Now let's move forward then, thinking about, now that you understand how to see a polarity and map it, let's look at the polarities that you actually took an assessment on for your executive team. If you recall, previously you did a SWOT analysis, and here you could see those results of strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And this was your information from your executive team. And based on this, we're going to now give you the viewing opportunity to see a SWOT analysis actually is a polarity, because you are looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the current situation. And here are those listed in this view from your SWOT, as well as the other pole is future. What are the opportunities and the threats in the future? Those are the upsides and the downsides for the greater purpose of engaging and being a high-performing leadership team. And when these are not going well and you're only experiencing the weaknesses and the threats, well then it's a disengaged and low-performing leadership team. So you can see how it's not an either or, but how this is an and. And this is interesting to notice because often we will hear things like, how do I balance work and life? And so the term balance of two different conflicting and competing priorities, if you think about and look at this image here, we don't actually want to balance the current and future of strengths and weaknesses, because it means we'd be experiencing the weakness and threats as much as the strengths and opportunities. So functionally, when we think about a polarity, what we actually want to do is leverage the poles where we are experiencing and maximizing the upsides of each pole while experiencing and experiencing the downsides of either. So this is what we mean by leveraging a polarity rather than balancing. And so that's something to start thinking about.
So now we will talk about your results. And thank you, all of you, for taking that assessment. And We will also illustrate the process that you went through, which is what everyone goes through as we map out and assess polarities, which is the small process that Petra mentioned. We've already done seeing, identifying what are those tensions, mapping them. We resourced a polarity library that's been used with hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations. And we targeted three tensions, which I'll show momentarily. We did the assessment, which you participated in, and now we're going into the learning. What can we learn from these results? During our next session on May 4th, we will get into leveraging. So what we identified, we wanted to identify an individual-based tension polarity, a team-based polarity, and a system-based polarity. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to get sustainable results. If we only focus on one of these without the other, it's an inherent polarity, then we will not have sustainable change. And based on the SWOT analysis, we identified these three polarities: directive and participative, tactical and strategic, centralized and decentralized. So you answered 12 questions for each of those polarities, and each of those 12 questions represented a statement from each of these maps. And what you see here, and you should have in your electronic files a handout of these maps, you see the statements basically for each of these polarities. Okay, so now we're going to go into the results, and I will give you a high-level overview of how to read the results. One of your next steps will include spending more time looking at these. Similar to perhaps a stoplight, green, yellow, and red or orange, similar to good, risky, and danger. And what you see in your results for each of the three maps is a good zone, a good to great zone. So this is the overall average score in how you are currently leveraging these polarities. If we want to delve deeper into that, we then go to the maps. Three maps, there were a total of 18 of you who responded, and again, good zone. So how do you look at this map? So this is tactical and strategic. What's important to note, and this just provides the landscape of this map, is in the center, you'll see on the upper arrow a number 79. So that is the overall, what you saw in the prior map, your overall score for how well you're leveraging this. We then can look at each quadrant to see, well, how are we doing with each quadrant as far as leveraging? So on tactical, what you'll notice is for that quadrant, the score was 85. Strategic, the score was 82, very highly scored. On the downside, on the bottom, what you'll also notice, we still want a high score, so that's still desirable. The difference here is you'll notice the rating scale is reversed. So a higher score represents seldom to never, whereas on the upper quadrants, a higher score represents often to almost always. So you'll see that difference. In addition, on this map, you'll notice the infinity loops. So the gray infinity loop is the ideal. The white is how you actually scored. So you can see visually the difference. And then you'll also notice there are these white or shaded bars in each quadrant, and those respond to the questions. So at a glance, you can tell in comparison performance. However, it actually gets much clearer on this slide. So this slide looks at each of the quadrants, each of the statements, and how you scored for each of those elements. Again, just by color, you can notice that your perception was that you are highly leveraging each of these items, with the possible question of, if you look at the downside of strategic, there's some question that you could act with greater urgency. That's fascinating, particularly when you look to your diagonal to the upper left, which is the upside of tactical, that you also notice that you're action oriented. That was your highest scoring item. We have no answer for that. The point behind all of this is to engage in dialogue around, what is that? What might that mean? How are we seeing that? That is basically how you would read these maps. If we go on, the next map is providing direction and inviting participation. All of this in service to high quality decisions and more commitment. Again, at a glance, you might notice that there seems to be opportunity by the white infinity loop. That also seems to be more in providing direction. If we go to the detail, what we see is a concern on the downside of providing direction, that we might be getting more than we would want, missing opportunities to engage people. So even though we scored pretty high on inviting participation, an opportunity for development might be even further leveraging engaging others. We also noticed, as the yellow star indicates, on inviting participation, that sometimes perhaps we get too many ideas about our future direction. Again, there's no right or wrong, good or bad about this. The value in this is your dialogue around how do you make meaning. What we want to do is we want to avoid the downside, so we want to score higher, and we want to leverage the upsides. The last map, and there was a lot of discussion during our session around this, is the system level polarity around centralization and decentralization. And again, what you can notice in the white loop is there was some concern around centralization. If we go to the next map, which shows the detail, particularly perception of red tape, that was your lowest scoring item in all of these. Also, downside of decentralization, misalignment between the Heart and Vascular Institute and system priorities. The opportunity here is to look at what's in your control and how you align with the system, Heart and Vascular Institute and the system. And please talk to your peers about this, because there was much energy and dialogue around this. So this slide, which is the final, I believe, summary slide, looks at what were your top 5 scoring items, celebrating that, and what were those lowest scoring items. And just noticing the distribution between the maps. And as we just mentioned, centralization and decentralization, really navigating that interrelationship between heart and vascular and Centra as a larger system needs.
As Joy just walked you through your map results, next what you had the opportunity to do was engage in activity together and to look at these map results and answer these questions. And so fascinatingly, what occurred during the session was each of the breakout rooms actually all chose the centralized, decentralized map to review. So in and of itself, that was informative. And your work ahead is to still go deeper and do thinking together and noticing what are the strengths that showed up for you as you think about these results. And what is your own interpretation, not just what we've said, but your own interpretation and meaning about the opportunities as you look at these maps and as you look at, are we experiencing these downsides and what do we mean by that? Because these are just sentences from a publicly available library, but what's our meaning inside of the HBI executive team? And that's what this is about. And what are you curious about? Because as we said, this is you in the learning step, which is the fourth step of small, in order to be able to effectively leverage these, you need to first learn what does it mean to us.
Before we get to your homework or field work between now and May 4th, we wanted to just illustrate what it looks like if we effectively leverage problem-solving thinking and polarity thinking. And again, what we wanted to do along with your input and speaking with Chad and Corinne was provide you a tool and a way of thinking differently that minimizes a waste of energy and provides for sustainable change and sustainable progress. And this illustrates the dynamic between leveraging both. So when we can effectively leverage solving problems with leveraging polarities, we can save time and we can accelerate desired change and accomplish results with minimal frustration, which is important to Petra and I as we also focus on well-being in our work. Okay, so what is next? You have between now and May 4th, when we will meet again. We want you to spend time sitting with this data and looking at it and discussing it. So we want you to notice as you go about your work in your committees and elsewhere, how are you thinking? Are you seeing something as a problem to solve, an either or might this be, whatever you're noticing, an example of a both and, a polarity? And name it and talk to people about it. And the context that we want you to think about this with, certainly we want you to think about everything, with everything, and most particularly, your life right now has several leadership transitions taking place. One, your CEO, and also as you anticipate leadership transitions with new roles in the Heart and Vascular Institute and future transitions that may also emerge. How can you better leverage, particularly the three that we focused on and others, so that progress is achieved and again, frustration is minimized?
And with you doing this field work, it will set you up for success for when we return on May 4th and go to the fifth step, which is really about how do we leverage our polarities. And this is when you spend time about creating action steps that will help you live into both of the upsides, as well as identify what are some of the warning signs that let us know we're favoring one side and neglecting the other pole in this polarity. So this is how you then are able to effectively leverage. And we will also bring in that session back what you learned in the retreat Joy referenced earlier with the FISBE model and the 3 vital questions. And so then next you will see some references, and our contact information is on the next slide in case you need to reach out before our next session. With that, we thank you for your attention and have fun noticing your thinking.